very clear, and I'll come to that too. So I'm going to today discuss old Baku, 19th century and 20th century, early 20th century Baku, just a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about these first entrepreneurs, the first oilmen who showed up on the Caspian pipelines. And then I'll conclude with where we are today, how the great game is being played today. Old Baku. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, not Texas and not Pennsylvania, but Baku was the oil capital of the world. 51% of the world's oil was produced here. When you look at the diaries that Western travelers going to Baku in the 18th century and the 19th century and the early 20th century said, they had a uniformly astonished description of what they saw at night in Baku, and that was this eerie blue glow that crossed the whole horizon. And this was the natural gas. The natural gas and oil in Baku was so close to the surface at that time that you actually could dig your hand into the soil and get to it just like that. And that eerie blue glow was the natural gas, spontaneously and deliberately lit. Deliberately, because the people would actually cook their food at times right there in the dirt, dig a hole, light the soil, and put their pot right there on the soil. This gas, being so close to the surface, could have horrific results. There was a diary in 1754 that described a stable with 8 horses blowing up and burning all of the horses alive. Somebody accidentally lit the ground there, and the stable blew up. And the amazing physics that this fire sometimes burned cold. Ludwig Nobel, the oil king of Baku, steered his steamship straight through the burning sea and came out fine. Ludwig Nobel, brother of Alfred Nobel, inventor of dynamite, namesake of the Nobel Prize. The Nobel family was the biggest oil family biggest oilmen in Baku. Ludwig Nobel by himself produced 9% of the whole world's supply of oil. But he was famous not because of that. He was famous because that family was so inventive. Ludwig Nobel invented the oil tanker. The oil tanker today that revolutionized the whole world economy was invented in Baku. The Zoroaster, the one at the top, 136 feet long. It carried 1,750 barrels of oil. No one believed on the outside, then or now, that the Russian Empire was capable of producing any technology worth adapting. So the West adapted this ship 8 years after he invented it. He invented a revolutionary means of refining oil. The West adapted it 25 years later. It's one of the surprising things that for me in looking at that region. These oil men created a cosmopolitan city right in the midst of a backward area of the Russian Empire and of the Persian Empire, and it collapsed when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and the oil fields were burned. Lenin found when he took power that he was going to lose the revolution. The Civil War had destroyed the whole empire, and it had destroyed the basis of the Russian economy, the oil fields. And so to save the revolution, he invited Westerners into Baku to revive these oil fields. And the first one who arrived was Henry Mason Day, Jim Giffen's forerunner. Henry Mason Day was from New York. He was a raconteur. He ended up as the official trade representative for all three republics in the Caucasus. What he found when he arrived in Baku was that the people had a very odd method of producing oil. They would put a man on top of a platform with a heavy object connected to a pole, and they would drop it repeatedly onto the soil until it created a hole, and that would be their oil well. It was called percussion drilling, and he brought this revolutionary, state-of-the-art oil drilling method, rotary drilling, and with some Germans and some other Americans, revived the oil fields. And in 1928, Stalin kicked them all out, the work being done. And in World War II, Stalin cemented all of the oil fields shut. He cemented them shut because he feared that Hitler was going to capture those oil fields. And historians today believe that if Hitler had captured the Baku oil fields when they were still working, we very well could have had a different victor in World War II. But that spelled the end of Baku. That was it. It went into decline. The oil industry went elsewhere, and its heyday was over until the Berlin Wall came down. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and Mikhail Gorbachev declared the Soviet Union open for business. The spirit that this produced around the world was electrifying. As I'm sure some people here remember. People saw that the Cold War was over. Free markets were going to take over the whole world. There was going to be a different day. And this spirit was especially captured on the Caspian Sea. And these oil men, Western oil men, who had spent all of these decades on the outside, knowing, tantalized by how much oil was in the Soviet Union, but they couldn't get at it because of the Soviets, rushed in. And where they rushed in was Baku. When the oilmen flew in, if they looked out of the left window of the plane, this is what they would see. This is the world's first offshore oil city. 10,000 people lived here. But by this time, it was falling into the sea, totally decrepit, and literally pieces of it falling into the sea. And if they looked out of the right side of the plane, what they would see, what several oilmen described to me, was a gorgeous city of trees. They would describe how mesmerized they were by this beautiful city that they just didn't expect of these trees until they got closer. The plane got closer to the ground, and they saw that those trees were not trees. These were the derricks. These were the old abandoned oil derricks from the 1920s and 30s, now abandoned and covered with oil, surrounded by these big pools of crude. The first American diplomat to arrive on the ground was a guy named Robert Finn. And he told me how when these diplomats came, they didn't get the same sort of accommodations that they came to expect in other parts of the world. He got a $60 a month apartment there, and he described it this way. He said, "The rats had the kitchen, I had the bedroom." An interesting sidelight of that was he told me this just a couple years ago after it became plain how important the region had become, and one of his colleagues told me that Finn had stolen the story from him. He said he was the one with the rats. The oil men who arrived on on the scene didn't do so without resistance.